Was the destruction of the Jews by Rome miraculous, demonic? The fall of Jerusalem, satanic. Our source, Ellen G. White, The Great Controversy, Mountain View, California. Pacific Press Publishing Association, 1888, 1907, 1911. This is not a historical source as such, but is an inspired commentary on history from a biblical point of view. Our first three quotes, page 28 and 29. God withdrew his protection from them and removed his restraining power from Satan and his angels, and the nation was left to the control of the leader she had chosen. Satan aroused the fiercest and most debased passions of the soul. Men did not reason, they were beyond reason, controlled by impulse and blind rage. They became satanic in their cruelty. Page 28. Satan was at the head of the nation, and the highest civil and religious authorities were under his sway. Page 28 and 29. Our fourth quote, page 35 and 36. By stubborn rejection of divine love and mercy, the Jews had caused the protection of God to be withdrawn from them, and Satan was permitted to rule them according to his will. The horrible cruelties enacted in the destruction of Jerusalem are a demonstration of Satan's vindictive power over those who yield to his control. Page 35 and 36. The Fall of Jerusalem. Our source, Henry Hart Millman, The History of the Jews, 3 volumes, London, John Murray, 1829, Volume 3. This is a historical source. Our first 4 quotes, pages 4 and 5, depictions of the temple prior to the Roman siege. And among the appointed victims, men, mortally wounded by the arrows of their own brethren without, lay gasping upon the steps of the altar. Page 4. Clouds of missiles were continually discharged into the upper court of the temple, and the whole sacred pavement was strewn with dead bodies. Page 4. They slew not a few of their enemies in the upper court, and some who came to sacrifice, for it was a strange feature in this fearful contest that the religious ceremonies still went on upon the altar, which was often encircled with the dead. Beside the human victims which fell around, the customary sacrifices were regularly offered. Page 4. Even strangers from distant parts would still arrive, and passing over the pavement slippery with human blood, make their way to the temple of their fathers, where they fondly thought the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still retained his particular dwelling within the Holy of Holies. Often, in the very act of prayer or sacrifice, the arrows would come whizzing in, or the heavy stone following thundering on their heads, and they would pay with their lives the price of kneeling and worshipping in the sacred place. Page 5. Our fifth quote, page 6, a depiction of the nation's leadership. In one point the 3 parties concurred, the persecution of the citizens, and in the condign punishment of every individual whom they suspected of wishing well to the Roman army, as their common enemy. Page 6. Our sixth quote, page 36, a depiction of the nation's leadership. He that was plundered by Simon was sent to John. He that had been stripped by John was sent to Simon. So by turns they, as it were, shared the bodies and drained the blood of the citizens. Their common crimes united them in friendship. They were jealous if either deprived the other of his share in some flagrant cruelty, and complained of being wronged if excluded from some atrocious iniquity. Page 36. Our seventh quote, page 6, a depiction of the average citizen. But it was even more dreadful to see the callous hard-heartedness which had seized all ranks. All were alike become reckless from desperation. There was no feeling for the nearest kindred. Their very burial was neglected. All the desires, the hopes, the interests of life were extinguished. Death was so near, it was scarcely worth while to avoid it. Men went trampling over dead bodies as over the common pavement, and their familiarity with murder, as it deadened the hearts of the citizens, so it increased the ferocity of the soldiers. Page 6. Our next 5 quotes, pages 34, 35, and 36. Depictions of the famine. No grain was exposed for public sale. They forced open and searched the houses. If they found any, they punished the owners for their refusal. If none was discovered, they tortured them with greater cruelty for concealing it with such care. Page 34. Every kind feeling, love, respect, natural affection, were extinct through the all-absorbing want. Wives would snatch the last morsel from husbands, children from parents, mothers from children. They would intercept even their own milk from the lips of their pining babies. Page 35. Old men were scourged till they surrendered the food to which their hands clung desperately, and even were dragged about by the hair till they gave up what they had. Children were seized as they hung upon the miserable morsels they had got, whirled around and dashed upon the pavement. Tortures which cannot be related with decency were employed against those who had a loaf or a handful of barley. Page 35. Sometimes it was done by those who had abundance of food, with a deliberate design of husbanding their own resources. If any wretches crept out near the Roman posts to pick up some miserable herbs or vegetables, they were plundered on their return. And if they entreated, in the awful name of God, that some portion at least might be left them of what they had obtained at the hazard of their lives, they might think themselves well off if they escaped being killed as well as pillaged. Page 36. Our next quote, pages 53 and 54, a depiction of one woman during the famine. There was a woman of Perea, from the village of Bethzab, Mary, the daughter of Eliezer. She possessed considerable wealth when she took refuge in the city. Day after day she had been plundered by the robbers, whom she had provoked by her bitter imprecations. No one, however, would mercifully put an end to her misery, and her mind maddened with wrong. Her body preyed upon by famine, she wildly resolved on an expedient which might gratify at once her vengeance and her hunger. She had an infant that was vainly endeavoring to obtain some moisture from her dry bosom. She seized it, cooked it, ate one half, and set the other aside. The smoke and the smell of food quickly reached the robbers. They forced her door, and with horrible threats commanded her to give up what she had been feasting on. She replied with horrible indifference that she had carefully reserved her good friends a part of her meal. She uncovered the remains of her child. The savage men stood speechless, at which she cried out with a shrill voice, "Eat, for I have eaten. Be ye not more delicate than a woman, more tender-hearted than a mother? Or if ye are too religious to touch such food, I have eaten half already. Leave me the rest." They retired pale and trembling with horror. The story spread rapidly through the city, and reached the Roman camp, where it was first heard with incredulity, afterwards with the deepest commiseration. pages 53 and 54. Our next quote, page 37, a depiction of Roman cruelty. Many poor wretches would steal down the ravines by night to pick up whatever might serve for food. For these, Titus laid men in ambush. When attacked, they defended themselves. As a punishment, they were scourged, tortured, and crucified before the walls. And in the morning, sometimes 500, sometimes more, of these miserable beings were seen writhing on crosses before the walls. The soldiers added ridicule to their cruelty. They would place the bodies in all sorts of ludicrous postures, and this went on till room was wanting for the crosses and crosses for the bodies. Page 37. Our next quote, page 43, a depiction of Roman cruelty. A man was seen searching his excrements for some gold which he had swallowed and voided. A report spread through the camp that all the deserters had brought off their treasures in the same manner. Some of the fierce Syrian and Arabian allies set on them and cut open their living bodies in search of gold. 2,000 are said to have been killed in this way during one night. Page 43. Our two next quotes, page 40 and 41. Depictions of a tomb of the dead and dying. For the instant effect of this measure, building a blockade, was to increase the horrors of the famine so far that whole families lay perishing with hunger. The houses were full of dying women and children, the streets with old men gasping out their last breath. The bodies remained unburied, for either the emaciated relatives had not strength for the melancholy duty, or in the uncertainty of their own lives neglected every office of kindness or charity. Pages 40 and 41. The soldiers, dreading the stench of the bodies, at first ordered them to be buried at the expense of the public treasury. As they grew more numerous, they were thrown over the walls into the ravines below. Titus, as he went his rounds, saw these bodies rotten, and the ground reeking with gore wherever he trod. He groaned, lifted up his hands to heaven, and called God to witness that this was not his work. Page 41. Our two next quotes, page 44 and 45. More depictions of a tomb of the dead and dying. A deserter, who had at one time been appointed to pay for the interment of the dead at a particular gate, stated that from the 14th of April, when the siege began, to the 1st of July, 115,880 bodies had been buried at the public charge, or thrown from the walls, not including those interred by their friends. Others said that 600,000 of the poorer people had perished, that when they could no longer bury them, they shut them up in some of the larger houses and left them there. Page 44. Yet still, though dead bodies actually impeded the way of the defenders to the walls, and though the city, like one vast sepulchre, seemed to exhale a pestilential stench, with unbroken resolution which might have become better men, the soldiers both of John and Simon went sternly trampling over dead bodies as over the senseless pavement, and manned the walls with that wild desperation which familiarity with death is apt to engender. Pages 44 and 45. Our next quotes, pages 57, 58, 59, and 60, depictions of the destruction of the temple. It was the 10th of August, the day already darkened in the Jewish calendar by the destruction of the former temple by the king of Babylon. It was almost past. Titus had retired to rest, when suddenly a wild and terrible cry was heard, and a man came rushing in, announcing that the temple was on fire. page 57. Titus rushed down with the utmost speed. He shouted. He made signs to his soldiers to quench the fire. His voice was drowned, and his signs unnoticed, in the blind confusion. The legionaries either could not or would not hear. They rushed on, trampling each other down in their furious haste, or stumbling over the crumbling ruins, perished with the enemy. Each exhorted the other, and each hurled his blazing brand into the inner part of the edifice, and then hurried to his work of carnage. The unarmed and defenseless people were slain in thousands. They lay heaped like sacrifices round the altar. The steps of the temple ran with streams of blood, which washed down the bodies that lay about. Titus found it impossible to check the rage of the soldiery. Even respect for the emperor gave way to the furious animosity against the Jews, to the fierce excitement of battle, and to the insatiable hope of plunder. Page 58. The whole summit of the hill which commanded the city blazed like a volcano. Page 59. The shouts of the Roman soldiery as they ran to and fro, and the howlings of the insurgents who were perishing in the flames, mingled with the roaring of the conflagration and the thundering sound of fallen timbers. The echoes of the mountains replied, or brought back the shrieks of the people on the heights. All along the walls resounded screams and wailings. Men who were expiring with famine rallied their remaining strength to utter a cry of anguish and desolation. The slaughter within was even more dreadful than the spectacle from without. Men and women, old and young, insurgents and priests, those who fought and those who entreated mercy, were hewn down in indiscriminate carnage. The number of the slain exceeded that of the slayers. The legionaries had to clamber over heaps of dead to carry on the work of extermination. Pages 59 and 60. Nothing remained but a small part of the outer cloister, in which about 6,000 unarmed and defenseless people, with women and children, had taken refuge. These poor wretches, like multitudes of others, had been led up to the temple by a false prophet, who had proclaimed that God commanded all the Jews to go up to the temple, where he would display his almighty power to save his people. The soldiers set fire to the building. Every soul perished. Page 60. Was the destruction of the Jews by Rome miraculous, demonic? You be the judge.